Our second keynote speaker is here. Something, yeah. It's been a very complicated, messy process putting this together. Thanks for your patience if you had to wait or something's gone wrong. Teresa Gutierrez was just down here a few months ago, and I nailed a commitment from her to come down here. She was so interested in the humanitarian immigration and refugee crisis that she and a little group came down as a kind of caravan, brought goods, publicized things, held a meeting at Lupe. And but actually I've known her for years in a strange way. I've read her articles many times over the years, and know the kind of international work that she does. The International Action Center, she's the Latin American and Immigration Coordinator for it. Writes articles on this stuff. Is based in New York, but is often here, and I think she might probably tell you how based she is in Texas. And I gave her an assignment to. So we're looking for someone. We're going to try and link up certain kinds of events. And so her assignment was to connect, and she said she'd do it. So this is holding her to account. Was to connect the immigration refugee crisis that we saw coming from the destabilizations in basically in Central America greatly, suffering coming up through Mexico, to connect that to Ferguson. Connected to the fight that took place and emerged in the late fall, particularly all over the country, demonstrations against police misconduct, police brutality, police profiling, and repression. So I don't think we've got anyone who can do a better job. So this is Teresa Gutierrez, the International Action Center.
So whenever I meet people, and they ask me where I'm from, because I live in New York City, I say I live in New York, but I'm from San Antonio. I never say I'm from New York because I love Texas so much, with all its faults. So I wanted, in preparation for this talk today, this phrase came up to me. It's a well-known phrase among literary circles, and it comes out of a book written by Charles Dickens, which frankly I've never read. And it's from the book A Tale of Two Cities. But the opening phrase in the book is very famous, and I think it's very apropos for what's happening right now, not only in this country but in the world. And that phrase is that it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. Right, exactly. So I say this because, as has been said, definitely those of us that have been fighting for immigrant rights, those of us that have been fighting for social change, whether it's against war or racism or for LGBT rights or for women's rights, whatever, I want to come out right now and say that all these things that I talk about, I'm coming from a revolutionary perspective. And I'm coming because I've been an activist since 1970. And you see so much, you experience so much. I was in Raza Unida Party, I was in Mayo, and you see so much. And so those experiences, if you're going to keep going year after year after year, you have to sort of have a perspective that sort of gives you the tools to keep going year after year. And I began to understand that all these problems that we face, whether it was 1970 or 1950 or 1920 or today, all come from the system. So if you don't know that, then how can you win and how can you change things? So that's where I'm coming from, that all these problems that we face today, which are dire more than ever before, come from the capitalist system, right? So I am very honored to be with the sister from CARE because, I'm one of those kind of activists that loses a lot of sleep over, can we do more for Colombia? Can we do more for Ayotzinapa? What about the immigration struggle? And certainly the war against the Muslim people is a war that should be countered, should be fought by all of us in the United States. And frankly, we don't know who did 9/11. They say that it's this or that. My hunch is that the people who gained the most from that attack in New York City was the 1%. It was the U.S. government, right? They're the ones who had the Patriot Act already in place. And by September 12th, because I lived in New York City by then, right? By September 12th, they had their war plans and their Patriot Act, and they had Muslims identified. How did you do that? How did you do that? How did you know that already? So you suspect that it was indeed the people who gained the most from that act of war. And frankly, the way the U.S. government functions around the world, it's not surprising that there's not more attacks like that. I mean, come on. How can you not be filled with anger? How can you not go crazy and carry out, acts that are not helpful? I'm not condoning them. They're not helpful. You have to have planned resistance. You have to have well-coordinated organization. You have to have demonstrations. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that the way the U.S. government, I didn't know, I'm an activist, I didn't know that 400 mosques were attacked in this country. That's outrageous. That is outrageous. That cannot be, right? So I want to talk a little bit, because the war to defend immigrant rights must be part and parcel of defending our Muslim sisters and brothers, because they are also a sector that's being targeted the same way, the way our Mexicano and Central American sisters and brothers are also being targeted. Now, I want to talk a little bit about my experience as an immigration activist. When you're a Mexicana or Chicana or however you identify yourself, fighting for immigrant rights, being conscious of immigration is part of your DNA. Whether you're in the movement or not, whether you're like my sister who was so colonized, who doesn't even say that she's Mexican American. She says, I'm American, I'm not Mexican. And I'm like, whatever, just sort of brainwashed, right? So, but nonetheless, even if you're like that, immigration is part and parcel of our lives. Whether you crossed the border last year or whether the border crossed you in 1828, right? It's just part of your life, right? So when in 2006 then, when the masses of immigrants, primarily Mexicanos, took to the streets in 2006, it was something that many of us who have been fighting for immigrant rights just were joyous. Finally, it happened. Millions of immigrants, millions of undocumented came out of the woodwork, and they took to the streets, not just once in the millions, but several times in that spring of 2006, in demonstrations that were larger than in demonstrations that have seen in the United States in centuries. And cities like Las Vegas or Dallas or other small, not just LA, not just New York, not just Chicago, but small towns came out with the migrant movement in record numbers. History was made in 2006. Finally, it was wonderful. But you gotta fast forward to today. And now we have over 2 million undocumented deported. People who have earned the right to be in this country, who created the wealth in this country, who have every right to stay here because they're forced to come here because of U.S. policies. They're forced to come here because of NAFTA, because of war in El Salvador, and everything else. They're forced to come here because the U.S. government allows this so-called war on drugs to be carried out in Mexico. They have the audacity to talk about problems in other parts of the world and condemn what goes on in Egypt or other places, when right at their doorsteps there is a war of terror being carried out against the Mexicanos, and they say nothing about it. And why? They not only not say anything about it, but they fund that war. They give complicity and they give money all the time. Why? Because Mexico is their colony. That's what they want it to be. And they are afraid to unfund that money that they do in Mexico. So, and then not only the deportation, but we have these horrible laws in Arizona and cities across the country. And you wonder, well, why demonstrate then? Why bother? Why bother doing what we did in '06? Well, of course, I know that all of you in this room are activists, and you know that we're going to keep plugging away, and we're going to find new ways and new things to do. And that's sort of what I want to do today. I want to talk about some of these kinds of developments and what's happening with regards to Ferguson, to sort of see what next steps. Now, I'm in the Make First Coalition in New York City, and we organize the May Day demo every year since '05, actually. And let's give a round of applause to immigrants who revived May Day in the United States. I mean, come on, May Day happened in the United States because of immigrants in the 1800s in Chicago, that it had been dormant for years, and now it's back. And this is a great thing. This is a great thing. So our coalition has been of the belief that if we're going to win rights for immigrants, if we're going to win legalization, then we have to connect to the other struggles. And our coalition has fought for that. You know, whether it was some war abroad, all our May Day rallies had an anti-war speaker. Even if people told us, well, what does that got to do with immigration? You know, and then we're like, it has everything to do with immigration. You know, U.S. war in El Salvador is why so many Salvadorans are here. And just because it's not Latin Americans doesn't mean you can't be fighting for Palestine, etc. You know, and you have those kind of discussions. You know, you have those kind of discussions where if immigrants come to your rallies and they have placards that say we are all immigrants, well, you should have a discussion with them and say, well, not really all of us, because Africans were brought here in chains. They didn't come here as immigrants. They came here as slaves. And if you want to build solidarity with the black community, and today that's even more important than ever, then you have to have those kind of conversations to have the right kind of language. I want to talk a little bit about the May Day experience in 2010, because that was the 2011, because that was the year. Wait, when was Occupy Wall Street? September 10 or September 11? 11. September 11? September 2011. Okay, so May Day 2012. I want to talk about May Day 2012. Because the Occupy Wall Street movement, which of course rose in New York and was carried out in other places of the country, was really very interesting. A very interesting experience because it was not just white, but it was primarily white, and it was very young, and they were occupying Wall Street, and they were saying that there's no jobs, there's no future, and Wall Street's to blame, and it really struck a chord among a lot of people. And it's really going to strike a chord for the oil workers who are on strike right now, and they're on strike, and this is kind of a privileged sector of the working class. They make good money, or used to anyway, and they have good benefits, but they're on strike because of job conditions, right? And they're on strike because they also know that when you put the profits of the 5 oil companies together, they made $90 billion. $90 billion in profits. So why are these oil workers having to work 7 days a week, 5 days a week, 40, 50, 60 hours, putting their own lives, but putting our lives at risk? Because some accident could happen. So the message that was sent out by Occupy Wall Street, therefore, resonated among a lot of people. You know, people were losing their houses. People can't go to school, or if you go to school, you have this humongous debt. How the hell do young people sleep? after college with that debt hanging over their shoulders. I mean, that's outrageous. Cancel the student debt. Just cancel it. The hell with it. You know, it's like, we have a right to go to school. These $90 million from the oil companies alone, we have a right to go to school without paying. There's examples of that. Canada, Cuba, you don't have to have that debt, right? So we have this huge crisis. We have our sisters and brothers, students in Ayotzinapa, missing 43 students that comprise hundreds, if not thousands, of people who have been killed and beaten and repressed, but they're fighting back. And this is the example that we have to take. We have to look to the struggle of Ayotzinapa for our answers here in the United States. I saw a video a day or two ago where the families were like marching into the military brigade in Guerrero. I mean, they just marched in with rocks and, you know, machetes and all that, and they're like saying, where's our students, where's our families? They're not afraid anymore, and they haven't been afraid for a very long time. And really, what options do you have? What options do you have when the government and the human rights offices and all of these people just lie and kill and repress? What options do you have to carry out that kind of struggle, right? And there are examples like this everywhere. I never thought that I would have to be organized in solidarity with the workers in Europe. Excuse me, I never thought that the workers in Europe would be in worse shape than we are. Because in some ways they are. And that's why there's 50% unemployment among Greek youth. 50%. You know, which of course sounds like the Black and Latino communities here of young people. So there's a crisis worldwide, and we have to sort of figure out who's the enemy and who's the root of that crisis. And it's not Muslim people, and it's not Black people, but it's the 1%, the ones that are making all these humongous profits. So let me look at Ferguson for a minute. And you know, every time that there's a rebellion in the United States, and this happened after Rodney King in Los Angeles. This didn't happen that much this time. But, you know, police brutality and police murders happen every damn day, excuse my language. It's just rampant. You know, Black and Latino youth already know the cops coming, stand up, go against the wall, you know, don't take out a candy bar, don't take out your phone, etc., etc. You know, that's not the way to live. I'm sorry. That's not the way to live. And I hope that everybody has read the new Jim Crow. And if you haven't, you need to buy it and you need to read it. And you will be horrified at the figures of how because of the war on drugs, our Black and Latino youth have absolutely no future once they fall under the judicial system in this country. For smoking dope or for using crack, you could face life imprisonment if you're Black and brown. A white guy doing the same thing will get a slap in the wrist. Why? Why? You have to ask yourself why. And you have to say, no, stop this. You have to fight back. So when Ferguson happened, it was in response to this ongoing, decades-long racist violence against our young people. And maybe you agree with the tactics used, and maybe you don't. I do, because I understand the righteous anger, right? And I think that you don't pay attention if you don't have a rebellion. You know, I know you have to be careful and you have to be winning, but you cannot blame the victim. You cannot blame Mike Brown if he had an attitude that day. He did not deserve to be killed. He did not deserve to have this police be his judge, jury, and executioner. No one deserves that. Cops don't have that right. They don't have that right to do that. So Ferguson sort of opened up the reality of what's happening with young people in this country. And it's a righteous rebellion. And if you're in Arizona, or if you're an anti-war activist, and you see the streets of Ferguson militarized, you see tanks, you see the helicopters, you see the drones, what is going on? Are we in Palestine? Well, maybe we are. Maybe we are. And you have to understand that the reason why the police are so armed is because the defense contracts that are being bought by the U.S. government. The U.S. government is actually pushing police departments across the country to buy these weapons. They want to sell this here. What war are they preparing for? What war? And it's a war against us, I believe. You know, it's not just about black and brown, but it's also like if the oil workers get too rowdy, or if some strikers get too rowdy somewhere else, what's going to happen? The cops are going to come with their tanks and so forth. And that's why part of our challenge as a movement right now is to demand that the government stop funding this military war, not only abroad, but here at home. That money should go elsewhere. That money should go for health care. It should go for studies. It should go for things that improve life, not destroy life. And that's part of what we have to do. I want to talk a little bit about the NYPD. I was doing some research about the NYPD, and I didn't know how bad things are. And this is important because, you know, it's sort of a big question of what are we going to do if the cops, you know, have these attitudes, and they have the tanks, and they have the machine guns, and they put on a suit, and they think they're a Rambo, you know, and most of them are white in our neighborhoods, but even the black and the Latinos sometimes, you know, lose it, you know, also. What are we going to do if they have all this power? And, you know, the president of the Police Benevolent Association in New York, Pat Lynch, is a frightening person. He's, you know, you hear him talking, and I think of fascism. That's what I think of. I think of a Hitler-type person, right? And when de Blasio, the mayor, spoke at the event in the early days of the upsurge, Pat Lynch organized the union, the police union members, and they shouldn't be called a union. I'm sorry, that's sort of a disservice. You know, they're not a union to me. They're a bunch of thugs that are given the green light to do that, and I think we have to say that. I mean, I feel that way. And this is a good example to show that. When de Blasio came into the room, he organized all these police to turn their backs on de Blasio. Now, if you were a Walmart worker and the CEO came in and you did that, you'd be fired. You'd be fired. And they are fired. You know, so why are these cops allowed to do that? And then they take to the airs, and they're on the TV, and they're on the radios, and they are talking some really serious stuff. They're blustering. You know, they come to demonstrations. We have this T-shirt, "I Can't Breathe," which is, of course, Eric Garner's last words as they beat him. They beat him to death with a chokehold that's illegal in New York State. They beat him to death. They chokehold him to death, and his last words, "I can't breathe." And the cops come to the demonstrations off duty with "I Can Breathe" T-shirts just like this. And they provoke us, and they talk bad. And now, worst of all, is that they are going to the New York State Senate, and they are asking that the laws for protesters be more strict. And now, if you resist arrest, if this passes, and it might, and even if it doesn't pass, they're practicing it anyway. 500,000 New Yorkers, primarily black and brown, were found to be stopped and frisked in 1 year alone. 500,000 were pushed against the wall, and they're killing us all the time in New York. You just don't hear about it. You don't hear about the 400 mosques, right? And now they want to pass a law that says that if you are resisting arrest at a protest, that it will now be a felony and not a misdemeanor, which means you could be in prison 1 year or 25 years. But if you all read Michelle Alexander's book, you know what that means. A year in prison for a black and brown person means your life is ruined, means you can't get public housing, means you can't get a job, means you can't function, you know, and it forces you to be part of the underground economy. It forces you to sell drugs, because what else are you going to do? I mean, if there's no support, you can't live on your grandmother's couch forever. When you start, you know, that's what this is showing. And so this is what the NYPD is trying to do right now, is to strengthen the repression. They have, there's 34,000 uniformed cops in New York City, and they get a budget of $4 billion a year. And if you see them and you in the subways with them, and they've got, it used to be when I first came to New York, or in the beginning, before 2011, before 9/11, if they had machine guns, it meant that it was September and that the heads of state from Venezuela or elsewhere were coming to the United Nations, because every September there's these heads of states that come, and so it's orange alert, on those times, right? And now these police have the weapons all the time. You take your train to work and you have it, and it looks like Mexico or it looks like other places around the world. And they have that attitude. Like, you're afraid to talk to them, you're afraid to look at them. They have that attitude, they're really, really nasty. And it's a scary thing. And so my point, and I'm going to end with this because I think my time is up, is that, okay, I have 4 minutes. If we are facing this dire economic crisis, if our young people are having a hard time finding jobs, or having a hard time finding funds to go to school, or if they are able to go to school and there's not the right kind of jobs and they're not making enough money, if they're forcing us to lose our pensions as teachers, etc., etc., if they're forcing the oil workers to work all these hours, risking the community and their lives, putting us in danger, then what is the solution? And I think that we have to think big, and we have to think in the spirit of Occupy Wall Street, and in the spirit of the struggle in Ayotzinapa, and in the spirit of the Palestinians who have never, ever, ever given up despite being occupied. Year after year after year, they've never given up. They fight and fight and fight, and that's what we have to do here. We have to look for a day when cops are disarmed. We have to think that way. Cops shouldn't be armed. They're not armed in Canada. They're not armed in England. Why do they have to have these arms? Why? They don't have to. They don't have to. We can resolve our problems without these weapons, without this attitude that they're occupying our neighborhoods, which they are. We have to build for a society where all the riches is shared. It's stolen from us, we want it back. If Canada can provide free healthcare, why can't the United States? There's no reason, other than there's no political will. And we have to build for a movement that forces an elected official, like that woman who took the microphone from the Muslim sisters and brothers in Austin the other day. We have to build a kind of movement where an elected official like that is impeached. This is not the way an elected official should conduct business. That kind of hatred, that kind of racism is terror. And that's the kind of terror that we need to fight. And so I am for building a movement that unites immigrant rights, that unites with women, that unites the anti-war struggle, that tells Ayotzinapa, we are with you, that tells the Palestinians, we are with you, that tells the Hondurans that their children don't have to leave because we're going to support their government that wants to do things for their children. And when the movement in the United States is like that, then the rest of the world will be able to breathe a little bit easier. Thank you.